Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast is your one-stop shop for fantasy football news and advice. Can't decide on who to draft on the first round? Going gaga on how to line up your team. We've got you covered. Traditional leagues, dynasty leagues, PPR leagues, IDP league, even daily fantasy football league. Join us as we break down all the questions of fantasy football. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast on the GSMC Podcast Network. I am their Friday host. As, my harmonics are not there yet. But you know what? Where we are is in the playoffs, baby. We are in the playoffs. 2 teams out of 2 in the big bowl. And it's about to go down because I don't think I have to face the same guy in my ESPN league that I faced beforehand. And his team is still as powerful as ever, theoretically. But we are going to hold out in hope that he continues to make certain mistakes and we can scoot past with a W. So we're going to go over matchups for both leagues that I'm in currently, and then we're just going to keep on going. We're going to talk about some starts and sits, and then probably go over just who is playing who in the NFL, maybe some injury report stuff, and all that stuff. So we're going to get right into that, of course. And to start it off, let's go ahead and talk about who am I playing in my league, which I just said. So I guess we're going to go over the bracket and how everything kind of fell into place. So, number 1 seed is a guy by the name of Maneuver and Prosper, and his team consists of a bunch of heavy hitters. So he has the Devontae Adams and Tyreek Hill and Darren Waller combo meal. Hurts bad. He has that. He has Raheem Mostert as well, who, he's been sitting on for a while. He has James Conner. Courtesy to me, I traded James Conner in like week 3 or 2, something like that. And he has Deshaun Watson, Will Lutz. Has the strongest team by far right now. Like, this is the strongest team. Like, it's very unlikely that most people can beat this team 6 out of 10 times a week. He is facing a guy named Trigger Happy, who has Tom Brady, Austin Eckler, Chris Carson, Terry McLaurin, Sterling Shepard, Rob Gronkowski, Clyde Edwards-Helaire, Buffalo defense. Yeah, man, that's a pretty strong team as well. Not gonna lie, pretty strong team. That is your 1 versus 8th seed. 1 is being Maneuver and Prosper. Trigger Happy is number 8. Then we have the 2 through 7, or the 2 versus the 7. So the Flock versus Do It for Dave, because Dave is his older brother, who in fact is not in the playoffs. He was 2 seeds behind. So the Flock, who, if I'm not mistaken, has been kind of on a downslope. He has Kirk Cousins, Derrick Henry, who cost him a game last week, Adrian Peterson, who for all intents and purposes might be a bad start, DK Metcalf, Deebo Samuels, Hunter Henry, Marvin Jones Jr., the Tampa Bay defense, and Steven Gostkowski. He also has Cam Newton and Josh Jacobs, who I assume is ruled out because he had 0.0 points. So that's a big thing. So he did not practice on Wednesday, and he was pessimistic Monday about Jacobs' chance of suiting it up on Sunday versus the Colts. And not much seemed to have changed in the last 2 days, so he's forced to miss a second consecutive game. Devontae Booker would be in line to headline as the back for Vegas. So just keep that in mind as well. His opponent, Do It for Dave, is starting Matthew Stafford, Aaron Jones, Antonio Gibson, Chase Claypool, Allen Robinson II, Evan Ingram, Brandon Ayuk, the Seattle defense in Younghoe Koo. Also star mentionings. He also has Rashad Higgins and Josh Reynolds, which is interesting because he has two. Those are two interesting wide receivers that would be interesting in a dynasty league stash, but for season to season, I don't know. Sometimes you just need a replacement, but those two kind of on the low end of things. Then it is a matchup of 3 versus 6, who, interestingly enough, I am number 6 out of 8. So Mr. Freebands Elite is round 2. It is the throwback fight. I am a 6.5 point underdog. And he has Kyler Murray starting, who at this point, it's safer to expect a 14-point performance than a 20-point performance. So they might just be spotting him because of what he's done for the earlier parts of the season. But that shoulder is definitely hurt, and he still plays on it. And you can see it. Kyler Murray. He has Nick Chubb, who is a dog. He has Miles Sanders, who is being, I guess, I don't want to say he's not handcuffed. That's the wrong phrase here. He's just not. It's not good right now because the Eagles are not good right now. So he also has Tyler Boyd, who, if he didn't have the one catch, we don't know what he would have had. Man, he was ejected. He has Tyler Lockett, who, by all intents and purposes, is probably going to have a much better game than he had last week because he's going up against the New York Jets defense. He has Mark Andrews back versus Cleveland, while Cleveland's kind of been surging. We'll see what they do. He has he has A.J. Brown going up against Jacksonville, who's a big-time play. He has Green Bay's defense going up against Detroit. And he has Miami Dolphins kicker. He has Corey Davis still on his bench, so understandably, you don't really want to trust Corey Davis all the time. If you have better options, you can have Tim Patrick as well, and Ben Roethlisberger if he wants to switch some things out, and Jacoby Myers. So his team is pretty solid across the board. We all know my team. I still have Taysom Hill until otherwise seen for change. So I have Taysom Hill, Alvin Kamara. Ronald Jones is back in the lineup because he was off by. Michael Thomas, Michael Pittman Jr., Austin Hooper, Cam Akers in the starting lineup. You won't change my mind about this. Cam Akers is starting, the New York Giants defense, and Harrison Buckner. So that is the team. Notable people on my bench, of course, is Tua Tagovailoa, Jakeem Grant, Denzel Mims, who I wish I could start, but I just can't. I can't do it. Michael Pittman seems like I need to give him one more chance, man. And I know it's playoffs, but I feel like he's not going to disappoint me. Even though Mims has not necessarily disappointed, but only having 2 receptions out of the game was really kind of disappointing. He didn't practice. He didn't practice on Wednesday as well, as he needs to attend to a personal matter. But Adam Gase indicated that Mims' personal issue could affect his status for Sunday's game. So this sounds like some Adam Gase stuff happening all over again. And the situation will warrant monitoring throughout the week. And he caught 2 passes on 3 targets last game. And that's not something that I'm particularly fond of, even though he did get it. 2 catches for 40 yards. It's just I would like to see a little bit more. And I was hoping for a bigger performance. So last is the 5 and the 4 seed. So number 4 is used car salesman, and number 5 is pursuing our dreams. So used car salesman here. Josh Allen at his quarterback. He has Nyheim Hines starting, James Robinson, Robert Woods, Deontay Johnson, Dallas Goedert, David Montgomery, which is expected to score 17 points this week, which is insane. The LA Rams defense, and Blankenship as his kicker. He has J.D. McKissick on his bench, Jalen Reagor, and Derek Carr if things needed to shift, and Jordan Reed if he wanted to. He has Justin Herbert. Pursuing Our Dreams has Justin Herbert, Ezekiel Elliott, Jonathan Taylor, Juju Smith-Schuster, Robbie Anderson, Travis Kelce, J.K. Dobbins, the Philadelphia defense, and Carlson for the Raiders. Notable things, he has Tony Pollard, Kiki QT, which is an honestly good pickup. Logan Thomas and Devontae Booker on his bench. So this guy could honestly switch out a lot of players, and I would be really, really concerned. I don't know why. I would honestly, I wouldn't start a tight end at my flex if I was him. It does, in particularly, feel bad that I would not be able to pick him up, and that would be Kiki QT. I probably should have done it last week, but who would have known? Nobody, really. So that's just got to chalk that one up to the game as per usual and just move on from there. So that is what is going to happen for the ESPN League. And now let's move on to Big Yahoo. We have playoffs about to kick into gear. And there is a 1 seed bye, which honestly I didn't expect. There's a 1 and a 2 seed bye. So it's just me. It's just 2 teams or 2 sets of teams playing this week. And I am going up against a team that I cannot say their name because it's a bit inappropriate for podcasting at this stage. So his team consists of Taysom Hill, Calvin Ridley, Devontae Adams, Ezekiel Elliott, Wayne Gallman Jr., Noah Fant, Chris Carson, and Carlson, the kicker for Las Vegas and the San Francisco 49ers. This is a guy who has Devontae Booker, Myles Gaskin, Kareem Hunt, J.K. Dobbins. His team is in Kenny Golladay, who's hurt, Brandon Cooks, who's questionable. His team is pretty stacked. Not gonna lie. Pretty stacked. Keep in mind, though, this is non-PPR. If this was PPR, I would just concede because I'd be terrified, right? Completely terrified. But thankfully, this is not the case, so I'm feeling a lot better about that. In other news, here is my team currently. I have Russell Wilson going up against the Jets. I have Stephon Diggs, Amari Cooper, David Montgomery, Josh Jacobs, who will probably be replaced by the end of the week. In his spot, Dallas Goedert, Justin Jefferson, Myers, kicker for the Seattle Seahawks and the New Orleans defense. Notable people on my bench is Miles Sanders, Jarvis Landry, Leonard Fournette, T. Higgins. And T. Higgins is kind of banged up. And I have Kirk Cousins if things go awry. For the 4 and the 5 seed, somebody named Team Zachman has Josh Allen starting, Tyler Lockett, Adam Thielen, Nick Chubb, Ronald Jones II, Tyler Hawkinson, Terry McLaurin, Matt Prater in the Los Angeles Rams defense. Notable mentions, Antonio Gibson, Matt Ryan, and that's it. He has 2 defenses on his bench, which is interesting. But you know what? He's made it to the playoffs. No need to question individuals for their decisions when they've made it to the big dance. And then on his opposite side is Mr. Dirty Bird. So he has Ben Roethlisberger, Robbie Anderson, Tyler Boyd, Dalvin Cook, Derrick Henry, Eric Ebron, Chase Edmonds, Younghoe Koo, and the Carolina Panthers defense. He has a few people. He has Nelson Aguilar. He has Jalen Reagor. And he also picked up Jalen Hurts. So this is a team that honestly has been kind of on the down slope from what I've seen, but things move silence. And maybe he's just moving a little bit in silence. And that's all that matters. So couldn't secure a first round bye. That would have been phenomenal, but alas, I was 8-5 in the first 2 seeds. We're 9-4. It is a tough time to be in that situation, man. You just never know what is to come out of those sort of scenarios. So you're just hoping for loss. If you just handled your business, talking to myself, if I just handled my business, I wouldn't have even gotten to that point. But here we are. Those are my fantasy leagues in particular. Don't have much to say on daily fantasy just yet because daily fantasy continues on for the rest of the year. So when we talk about matchups and all that stuff, you'll kind of get a gist of who you would like to start in daily fantasy and all of that coming up soon. Gotta say, real quick, I wanted to talk about this James Harden situation. What are you doing, man? What are you doing? Get to work. Come to work. In fact, I don't even know why he recorded himself or allowed himself to be recorded while doing all of that. That was just foolishness. And it's honestly, he deserves to be fined. That's a tough scene. And I'm glad that there hasn't been an NFL player during the season that I know of that's done foolishness like that. Probably because their money is not fully guaranteed. So shout out to non-guaranteed contracts for the first time ever. I don't think anybody else has said that before. Anyway, we're going to take our first break. GSMC. We'll be right back. Do you ever feel like you're just always on, where things are just going, and there's always hustle and bustle, and you just want to relax, man? And the best thing I do to try and relax is to drink Coors Light, man. It is the beer literally made for you to chill. Coors Light is the beer that I always choose on a Sunday afternoon when I'm done watching the Saints stress me out week in and week out. I gotta choose Coors Light. Mountain cold refreshment made to chill. Coors Light is the cold lagered, cold filtered, and cold packaged. It's literally made to chill, man. It's crisp and refreshing, and as the Colorado Rockies, perfect for a moment to unwind. So Coors Light is the one I choose when I need to unwind. So when you want to hit reset, reach for the beer that is made to chill. Get Coors Light in the new look delivered straight to your door at get.coorslight.com. Celebrate responsibly. Coors Brewing Company, Golden, Colorado.
Are you looking for the very best NFL and college football podcast? Then check out the GSMC Football Podcast. Get the latest football news both on and off the field. From the NFL Draft to trades to the rumor mill to the NFL Combines, they got you covered. That's GSMCpodcast.com/football-podcast. Get updates on college rivalries, game day insights, and much, much more. It's football talk the way you want it. This show eats, sleeps, and breathes football. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
All right, we're back, GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast listeners, and we are going to go ahead and get right into who to start, who to sit, what are we doing for Week 14. We got to look at the rest of the schedule, what's happening, and you already know what's going on. Most leagues have kicked off for the fantasy playoffs this week, and I'm pretty sure that means you need all the help that you can get. And there's no bad reason to keep a good player you might start, but anyone who you have who you're not confident in starting probably is a candidate to get cut. Could you add a second quarterback or a second defense? And if you're streaming those positions, it's a great idea to have at least 1 week ahead by finding the matchups you love in Week 15 as well. So that is what we're about to get into. So for quarterbacks, sit him, Jared Goff. So Goff's predictability has been hard to deal with, and he is much better in seven road games, well over 20 fantasy points, than his 5 home games, which is exactly 24 with under 20. And he seems to go well when his running backs do well. In the 8 games when his Rams rushers amass at least 10 fantasy points, Goff has had 20 plus in 6 games. Goff finds himself on a short week home against the Patriots defense that's rapidly improving against the run and the pass. And if the Patriots found ways to stump Kyler Murray and Justin Herbert in consecutive games, they scored 11 fantasy points combined, keep in mind, then your money has to be on keeping Goff off the field, having a big game, or, considering that he'll have a big game. However, to start him, Cam Akers. So Cam Akers finally played to expectations last week, scoring in his 3rd straight game while posting season highs as a leading touch getter with 22 and snap percentage, 63% among Rams rushers. He also saw 7 carries inside the 10-yard line, but only scored on 1 of them. And you like to think that Akers' physical style has been recognized by the Rams coaching staff and seemingly has put him ahead of Malcolm Brown in the short yardage role, but who knows if he'll keep it after last week and how many touches and snaps he'll get if Darrell Henderson doesn't miss 1.5 quarters like he did in Week 13. And will any of it even matter against the Patriots' run defense that over the past 5 games have kept runners to 3.5 yards per carry with 2 rushing scores? He's best as a flex, but if you had to start him as your number 2 running back, you probably would be okay anyway. Another sit would be Cam Newton. So Newton did the unthinkable last week, run for 2 touchdowns and throw for another despite totaling under 100 passing yards and under 50 rushing yards. Doing it again versus the Rams would be utterly impressive. This is a defense that has held 4 of the past 6 quarterbacks it has faced to 10 or fewer fantasy points. 10. Only 3 have exceeded 20 fantasy points on the season, and the Rams has had more interceptions than passing touchdowns allowed in their past 4 games. And that matchup is simply to expect good results from Cam Newton, considering that he has not been a good passer of the football this year. Then someone like Damien Harris might be someone to sit, and if you're starting Harris, you're hoping he does something he's only done twice all season, and that is to score a touchdown. That's because the Rams, for all their strength on the defense, has given up a rushing touchdown to a running back in 5 straight games, which is kind of crazy, but they've also held every single running back they faced in the past 8 games to under 80 total yards, and that's kind of crazy. Harris is already losing goal line work to Newton, so the odds of him scoring are slim in any matchup. Expecting him to rumble for a bunch of yards against the defense is even harder to imagine. For Minnesota at Tampa Bay, stardom would be Kirk Cousins, and it's scarier to roll out Kirk Cousins on the road against an aggressive defense like this one, but the Buccaneers have let up a minimum of 20 fantasy points to 6 straight quarterbacks, including Daniel Jones, Derek Carr, and Jared Goff. And that'll suit Cousins nicely as he's managed at least 21 fantasy points in 5 straight games, including a tough road game at Chicago 4 weeks back. There are 2 more layers to consider. The matchup is actually tougher for Dalvin Cook than it is for Cousins, and the Buccaneers offense should have no problem matching the 27.4 points per game that the Vikings are allowing this season. And this should push Cousins to have a higher than normal pass volume game script and a critical factor in his recent fantasy success. Notable bust candidate would be Kyler Murray. So Murray has clearly been affected by his shoulder. In his past 3 games, he's averaging 63% or 63.5% completion percentage rate and a 5.3 yards per attempt and 5 rushes per game for only 4 yards per attempt. In his first 9 games, his completion rate was 68%, and his yards per attempt netted at like 7.6, and he has averaged about 10 carries per game and nearly 7 yards per attempt. And there's more. Murray's bad ball rate has ballooned to 22% on his throws in this past 3, 27 in his last 2 versus 14 in his first 9 games. And now he'll face a Giants defense that's yielded just 20-plus fantasy points to 3 passers all season. Only 5 have 17-plus. And it'll take some guts to bench Murray, but he's clearly not producing like he did earlier in the season. And it'll be a tough matchup on the road. Guys like Justin Herbert, Kirk Cousins, Ryan Tannehill, and whoever plays the Saints or plays for the Saints are safer starts, which is interesting. Another sit will be Clyde Edwards-Helaire. So the Chiefs have gone full Mahomes. Over the past 5 weeks, the Chiefs ranked in the bottom 5 in running back touches per game at 19.8. And the running back carries per game at 15.8. Only once in those games has a Kansas City running back managed 15 touches, which is Clyde Edwards-Helaire in Week 11 versus Las Vegas. Also happening, the Chiefs aren't consolidating their running backs at all. Le'Veon Bell and Darrell Williams have floated around 26% snap rate each, while Edwards-Helaire has been healthy, giving the rookie the rest of the playing time. It's the three-headed monster Clyde Edwards-Helaire, detractors feared back when the season started. He's not even the preferred option at the goal line, playing just 7 snaps on the goal to go down of 3 yards or closer in his past 5, with only 1 carry converted for a score. Until Clyde Edwards-Helaire plays more and plays better, fantasy managers should probably not trust him, and that goes double this week as the Dolphins have yielded just 2 rushing touchdowns to running backs in their past 7 games, with no 100-yard rush games allowed on the year. Another sit would be Devontae Parker. So Parker is doing his best he can with Tua Tagovailoa at his quarterback, but the results have not been very good. Tua has made Parker his top target with 28 throws his way, but only 57% of them have been caught and just 9.4 yards per catch. In fact, Parker has an average depth of target of just 5 yards in the games Tua has played in, and that's not good. Tua played a lot better in the second half last week against the Bengals and continued to show an affinity for Parker on the short end zone throws, 3 targets, no receptions. Fantasy managers will need that connection to come through if Parker's going to have a great day. Kansas City ranks 3rd in fewest fantasy points to receivers, but has led up 3 touchdowns inside the 10 to wideouts in the past 5 quarters. And think of Parker as a touchdown or bust receiver who can't even be counted on for more than 6 receptions with Tua Tagovailoa at the helm. Another start would be Ryan Tannehill. If A.J. Brown and Corey Davis are must-starts, then their quarterback are must-starts, or their quarterback is a must-start as well. He dazzled last week while playing from behind against the Browns, notching his 9th game of the season with 20-plus fantasy points and 4th with 30-plus. He'll face another awful secondary this week as the Jaguars are generously provided a minimum of 20 fantasy points to 6 straight quarterbacks, 22-plus in 5 of the 6. The Titans' shaky defense should afford some numbers to the Jaguars' offense too, likely putting Tannehill in a situation where he will need to throw more than hand it off, and he's among the safest fantasy quarterbacks this week by far. A sneaky sleeper would be Dalton Schultz. So Dalton Schultz here has wrangled at least 8 PPR points in 4 of his past 5 games and takes on the Bengals defense that gave up over 100 yards per game and 74% catch rate to tight ends in the past 2. Since he also has given up red zone scores to man-child Mike Gesicki last week and it's first in his past 5, Schultz has his best catch rate of any regular target on Andy Dalton's team, which was 79%, and should be a factor in the Cowboys' passing game. A stardom would be Giovanni Bernard. So there's a massive trust issues with Bernard as a fantasy starter since his past 4 games have been colossal duds. But the last 4 matchups were against the Dolphins, the Giants, Washington, and the Steelers, 3 of which who rank in the top 7 of fewest fantasy points allowed to running backs in the past 5 weeks. And this week he'll get the Cowboys, who have allowed the 3rd most fantasy points to running backs in the past 5 weeks and the most over the past 3 weeks. 5 touchdowns, 5.9 yards per carry. And that is not enough to convince you that they'll be convincingly terrible. Keep in mind that the Cowboys are on the road for their 2nd game in 5 games, on 5 days rest, Bernard is in the right place at the right time as the number 2 fantasy rusher and a dreamy daily fantasy points or daily fantasy sports tournament option. For the Texans at Chicago, of course, you want to start QT. So give me the chance to see every down work for the Texans. QT looked like a completely different player when we last saw him. He thrashed the Colts' zone defense with over routes and finding soft spots and settling in for easy targets from Deshaun Watson. He even could have had a touchdown on a corner post route, but Watson was a little late with the football. Chicago plays zone defense about 2/3 of the time and has a lackluster pass rush this week, affording the big game to Matthew Stafford and the Lions. If the defense plays like that again, Watson will have a smash hit game, and QT could see plenty of targets out of the slot. And it helps that the Bears have allowed a pair of touchdowns to receivers in 3 straight games. QT is raked as a flex, but you shouldn't be surprised if he's finished as a top 24 receiver in PPR by the end of the day. A flex starter would be Tim Patrick. So although more targets would be more viable, you can't complain about his 2 red zone touchdowns in week 13. And you also can't complain about the 23 targets he's had in week 10 through 12. And we're ignoring the Kendall Hinton game, of course. Patrick is clearly the number one option for Drew Lock in Denver's passing game. He should see a rise in targets against the Panthers' pass defense that's given up 7 touchdowns to receivers in the past 4 games. Patrick has at least 10 PPR points in his last 4 games with an actual quarterback. For Jets versus Seattle, a flex starter in PPR would be Jamison Crowder. So Crowder supposedly is the most reliable Jets player and the fantasy managers can roll out with. And it helps that Denzel Mims won't play, increasing the likelihood that Crowder will see at least 7 targets. That minimum has helped Crowder accrue at least 11 PPR points every single time this season, including the last week's 2-score resurgence against the Raiders. The Seahawks pass defense has actually improved over the past 4 weeks. 8.9 yards per catch, no touchdowns allowed to receivers. So if you're going to start Crowder, you're hoping that Sam Darnold to lean on him as much as he did earlier in the season. And then for Indianapolis Colts for Las Vegas Raiders here, a sneaky sleeper will be Phillip Rivers. He bounced back in a major way last week, beating up on the bad Texans secondary and notching his 3rd straight game of at least 21 fantasy points. And we know he's got a toe injury, and we know his left tackle might be a 3rd stringer, and we know Phil Rivers is capable of a meltdown at any point, but the matchup against the Raiders is too good to ignore. Vegas has allowed 20 points or more to the enemy quarterback in 6 of the past 9 games, including 23 to Sam Darnold in Week 13. It would help that the Raiders' pass rush is missing a couple of key players as well. Rivers shouldn't be viewed as a high-ceiling quarterback, which is why guys like Kyler Murray and Matthew Stafford should be started ahead of him, but he is among the top streaming choices you could make, and should be better than the other quarterbacks in the game. So flex starter would be T.Y. Hilton. So with touchdowns in back-to-back weeks, Hilton was back on the proverbial fantasy map. What changed really for him was, for starters, Rivers is finding him again. The 16 targets Hilton had in the past 2 weeks is the most in a 2-game span for him or any Colts pass catcher this season. Hilton also seemed to have a really good timing with Rivers last week, stopping at the perfect point on the sideline route for a big game and being open in space for an over-the-shoulder grab that wound up being a touchdown. Hilton's breakaway speed on the touchdown was also good to see, by the way. The Raiders have allowed 2 passing scores to Jamison Crowder last week and at least 1 score to a wide receiver in 8 of their last 9 games. So maybe Hilton is a sneaky pick and is peaking at the right time. Somebody who you would probably want to sit is Devontae Booker, and I'll tell you right after this break. GSMC will be right back.
Check out the show that's built on the MMA. From the UFC to extreme cage fighting, they got the fights covered. Check out the GSMC MMA podcast. Get the latest news on past or upcoming fights. Join us as we talk to and about some of the biggest names in the MMA, past, present, and future. When it's the fight game, there's just one show to check out. GSMCpodcast.com/MMA-podcast. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
All right, we're back, GSMC Fantasy Football Nation, and we were going over some starts and sits for Week 14, first week of the fantasy playoffs, and we just left off on Devontae Booker and why you should probably sit him versus Indianapolis. So what we were hoping for last week was Booker racking up over 15 touches and finding the end zone against the Jets. And what did we really get? Racking up 17 touches for our disappointing stats while playing just 42% of the snaps. Truth is, the Raiders' offensive line is just different without Richie Incognito helping move defenders around, and you can't imagine it's magically going to improve, even against the Colts defense that's been showing some cracks lately. Even if you toss their Week 12 matchup against the Titans when they didn't have DeForest Buckner on their D-line, Indy's allowed a running back to get 10-plus non-PPR points in 3 straight games. So Booker will need to score in order to be good for your fantasy squad, and that might be asking for a bit too much right now. A stardom in PPR would be J.D. Mckissick. So Antonio Gibson has been taking some of McKissick's passing down snaps, but then he suffered a turf toe injury last week and figures to at least miss Week 14. And that opened up the door for McKissick to play a whopping 74% of the snaps last week, netting him 10 receptions, 5 carries for 78 total yards. And if anything, his involvement in the offense shows that Washington really doesn't want to lean on slugback Peyton Barber unless they are in a clear running down and or in short yardage situation. Before last week, we called McKissick a game script dependent PPR option. And that's probably still the case this week, but Gibson's absence should cement McKissick into a prominent role and a shot at a good reception total. The Niners have allowed 79% catch rate and 8 yards per catch to the opposing running backs on the season. Logan Thomas will be a risky starter. While when Washington was down 2 scores last week, Alex Smith's most reliable target was his large, non-explosive tight end, who was constantly left open in short yardage gains. Not until in the game did he start running and connecting on downfield routes. There's a fairly realistic chance that without Gibson powering a good running presence for Washington, that Alex Smith will have to throw a bunch. That in turn would mean nice target volume for Thomas. That alone would make him a top 12 tight end start, but that could be as good as it gets for him. San Francisco did yield a touchdown on a tight end last week, but it's just his 3rd score to the position all year. And only one tight end, Mckissick, exceeded 60 yards against the Niners in 2020. And a weird fact, Thomas has 5+ targets in 7 games, but under 8 PPR points on 4 of them. Consider other options before you're going with Logan Thomas. A bust candidate would be Raheem Mostert. Mostert is still a sleek, speedy running back who fits in the 49ers run scheme perfectly, but he's also seeing less than 50% of the snaps. And as last week proved, a candidate to be stuck around 10 touches per game, having Jeff Wilson be used as a hammering power back, hurts Mostert's upside. And it's a matchup against a legitimately good Washington front 7 that really makes people nervous to start Mostert. In the past 7 games, Washington has allowed just 1 rushing touchdown to a running back holding the position to 3.7 yards per carry. Mostert has come through with 10+ non-PPR points in 4 of 6 games this year, but he's going to lose touches to Wilson moving forward, and he should probably only be used when matchups are better than this. Moving on to New Orleans versus Philadelphia, big bust candidate is Miles Sanders, and there's too much working really against him right now. His playing time has decreased in each of his past 4 games. His touches have fallen from 19 to 8 to 10 in his past 3. Sanders himself admitted that this week that he hasn't been sharp in the pass catching and pass blocking this past 2 weeks, and it's cost him playing time. Then there's the Eagles' offensive line, which has been and will be a massive problem. Plus, rookie Jalen Hurts will make his first NFL start, and the Saints' suffocating run defense, which allows the fewest fantasy points per game to running backs this season, is coming to Philly. And there has been talk about the Eagles utilizing their running backs more, but there's no clear indication that Sanders will be back in his workhorse role that he was back when the year began. And it might feel dangerous to bench Sanders, but this is where the running back not taking it round. But this was where the running back not taking it round 1. It would be an easy bench. Sanders hasn't played like a round 1 pick much for this year. A start for the Atlanta Falcons versus Los Angeles Chargers is Hayden Hurst. So if Hurst can get it done this week, he can't be trusted again. Or if he can't get it done, he can't be trusted again. And that's because the Chargers have allowed a touchdown to tight end in 5 of their last 6 games. Simple as that. This has been a get-right matchup for the position all season. And it should also help Hurst that the Falcons' run game is a question mark with Todd Gurley and Ito Smith both banged up. Finally, not in a tough matchup, Hurst and his 5.7 targets per game warrant one last good ride. And for Green Bay at the Detroit Lions, sneaky sleepers will be Marvin Jones and Matthew Stafford. So last week worked out marvelously for the Lions' newfound up-tempo passing game because the Bears' pass rush was lackluster. The Packers' pass rush is statistically better than the Bears, but only by 3.1% in terms of pressure rate. Expect the Lions to keep the fireworks coming, just as they have in pretty much every game they've played against the Packers in the past 5 years. Stafford has had multiple scores in 10 of his last 11 against the Packers, scoring 20-plus fantasy points 7 times. Plus, Phillip Rivers and Mitchell Trubisky each found 24 fantasy points within the Packers' past 3 games. Jones should also benefit as the Packers' pass defense really hasn't dominated, giving up 5 scores to receivers over the past 5 games. Jones himself has at least 8 non-PPR, 10 PPR points in 5 of his last 7 games. Steelers at Buffalo. So this is kind of a mixed bag for Deontay Johnson, Juju Smith, and Chase Claypool. So Johnson has been too good to sit. He delivered 11-plus non-PPR points in 3 of his past 4 with 13 targets per game. In that drops or not, he is going to keep delivering for the Steelers. Juju Smith-Schuster's yardage was comically awful against Washington, but his role as a reliable slot receiver still hasn't changed. His target share has racked up in his past 7 games, which 9.4 per, making him an easy start in PPR, but not quite as easy in non-PPR because his yardage has been so shaky. Then yards per catch in his past 3 games. Then there's Chase Claypool, whose playing time really took a hit with a 10-game low of 44% on Monday's snaps. That led to just 4 targets on 38 yards, both 6-game lows. Claypool remains in flex discussion, if only because his size-speed combination puts him in position to score against anyone. But you should be worried his Week 13 usage as a sign of things to come. Buffalo's pass defense has bottomed out as 5 receivers have notched at least 12 non-PPR points in its past 4 games. Then we have Baltimore at Cleveland. So a risky starter would be J.K. Dobbins. You got really lucky if you started Dobbins in Week 13, despite doing absolutely nothing to warrant a drop-in playing time. Dobbins played just 38% of the snaps against the Cowboys, his lowest in 6 games. His 11 carries was his second lowest total in the last 5 games, and he was a non-factor in the passing game. And he saw Gus Edwards have more rushing yards on fewer carries, and not to mention Lamar Jackson having more carries and more yards. There's no evidence to suggest Dobbins will go back to being Baltimore's best running back, which means we shouldn't count on him to be anything more than a hyper-efficient rusher on 10 to 12 touch diet. And it's not fun, but he's a risk, even as a number 2 running back, by the way. The Browns' defense, he'll see, is a sliver of touches against held Derrick Henry to 60 yards last week. Keep that in mind. So, things are all the way. So let's just recap and do some things, and let's talk about the top fantasy football picks for Week 14. So one player that this current model is extremely high on this week is Justin Jefferson. Minnesota's wide receiver continues to put up monster numbers in his first season in the NFL. Jefferson is coming off another strong showing in Minnesota's victory versus the Jaguars, recording 9 receptions for 121 yards and a touchdown. Jefferson became just the 5th player in league history to record at least 1,000 receiving yards in his first 12 games. He's also been one of Kirk Cousins' favorite targets in the red zone over the last few weeks. In fact, Jefferson has found the end zone 4 times in his last 3 games. Sportline's model is expecting Jefferson to have another big game on Sunday against Tampa Bay, who has given up 23 touchdown receptions already this season. And the model ranks him as a top 10 wide receiver this week and a solid wide receiver 1 option. And the massive shocker is Bills quarterback Josh Allen, who threw for 375 yards and 4 touchdowns last week against 49ers, stumbles big time and doesn't even crack the top 15 at his position. Allen continues to churn out multi-touchdown performances, with Monday's outing marking his 9th of the season. He also thrown for over 300 yards 6 times in 2020. However, Allen and the Bills face a stiff test against Pittsburgh Steelers on Sunday night. Pittsburgh's defense ranks first in the NFL with 16 interceptions this season. In addition, the Steelers feature the top-ranked scoring defense, giving up just 17.6 points per contest, with one of the toughest fantasy football matchups. Allen is a player to consider putting on the bench for Week 14, potentially. And that's all I really have to say on that. So those are just some key people that you could sit there and probably get away with. So start of the week, like we talked about, is Ryan Tannehill. So, the Titans were really embarrassed in Week 13 against the Browns loss, but the score didn't really reflect it. The Cleveland led 38-7 at halftime, and it was an ugly performance for a playoff caliber team like Tennessee. But for fantasy managers, it was a great game for Ryan Tannehill, who scored 33 fantasy points. And we don't care about the actual score of the real game. We just want Tannehill to play well. And he did that with 389 passing yards, 3 touchdowns, and 1 interception. And you'll take that this week against the Jaguars as well. So, now it's doubtful that Tennessee are chasing points against Jacksonville, although it was a 33-30 Tennessee victory in Week 2. In that game, Tannehill had 34 passing or fantasy points, and he could have similar performance this week. He also scored 36 against the Jaguars in the meeting last year. Jacksonville is number 2 in touchdowns allowed to quarterbacks, and 6 quarterbacks in a row have passed for at least 2 touchdowns against Jacksonville themselves. Baker Mayfield, Kirk Cousins have each scored at least 22 points against the Jaguars in back-to-back weeks. Tannehill hasn't been good this season as last year, but he does come into Week 14 with 3 games in a row of at least 20 points, and this is a matchup that should allow him to keep on rolling, and Tannehill should be a top 5 quarterback at the start of the fantasy playoffs this week. So that is definitely some things, more quarterbacks to come here as we're about to wrap up the segment. Justin Herbert is a stardom. So Herbert was pretty bad in Week 13 against the Patriots with just 4 fantasy points. And by pretty bad, I mean he was pretty awful. And he's now combined for 22 points in his last 2 games against Buffalo and New England. And he should bounce back this week against the Falcons, who are number 1 in fantasy points allowed to opposing quarterbacks. For the season, 7 quarterbacks have at least 300 passing yards against Atlanta, and 5 have scored at least 3 total touchdowns. Taysom Hill is also a must start. Hill is expected to get at least 1 more start in place of Drew Brees, and that's a good thing for fantasy managers. Give Hill credit. He's been a nice surprise and a great fantasy asset over the past 3 games, scoring at least 23 points in 2 of those outings. And he finally threw a touchdown pass in Week 13 in Atlanta, and he's run for at least 44 yards in all 3 starts. With 10 rushing touchdowns over that span, the Eagles have allowed some big games to running backs this year, including Lamar Jackson, 108 yards and a touchdown, and Daniel Jones with 13 carries for 156 yards and a touchdown in 2 games. Hill once again has top 10 upside this week. Tom Brady at 43 probably needed a bye week to recharge, and even though this is a new team for him this year, he has scored at least 23 fantasy points on 3 of his past 5 games coming off a bye. And that's a good matchup for him against the Vikings, who is an inexperienced secondary and less than stellar pass rush. 6 quarterbacks have at least 280 passing yards against Minnesota, and 5 quarterbacks have at least 3 passing touchdowns. Brady has scored at least 27 fantasy points in just his past 2 afternoon games, and kickoff is at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We'll continue on this real quick, but we're going to take a break. GSMC will be right back.
Check out the show built around the women of MMA. From the UFC to the extreme cage fighting, we got the fights covered.
Listen.
It's the Golden State Media Concepts Women's MMA Podcast. The latest news of upcoming fights, discussions of previous matches. Join us as we talk to and about the biggest names in women's mixed martial arts, past, present, and future. When it's the women's fight game, you know where to listen to. The Golden State Media Concepts Women's MMA Podcast.
All right, GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast listeners, we are back to finish off the podcast this week with more banger information. And we were just getting off talking about who to start for quarterbacks for Week 14. Full list of some banger quarterbacks. We're going to continue on. So Lamar Jackson is, it's been a rough season for Lamar, but he reminded us of his greatness Tuesday night against Dallas with 3 total touchdowns, including 94 passing yards on the ground. And that's only the 5th time he's scored more than 20 fantasy points this season. And if you can believe that, and one of them was against Cleveland in Week 1 when he had 33 fantasy points. He has a tremendous history in 4 starts against the Browns, passing for 939 yards, 9 touchdowns, and 2 interceptions over that span, along with 56 carries for 314 yards and 2 touchdowns. It's a safe trust that Jackson will do it again for us this week. Ben Roethlisberger, so the Pittsburgh offense hasn't looked great in the past 2 games against Baltimore and Washington, but playing the Ravens on Wednesday and the football team on Monday might have something to do with that. Steelers also might want to invest in some better gloves or glue for their receivers based on the amount of drops we've had recently. Despite all the mistakes, Roethlisberger still has at least 20 fantasy points in 4 of his past 5 games, and he's attempted at least 42 passes in each game over that span. And that's a really good volume to love, and he should have another big game against Buffalo this week. The Bills have allowed 3 of their past 4 opposing quarterbacks to pass for at least 316 yards, and 2 quarterbacks over that span have at least 3 total touchdowns. Some sleepers, some big sleepers. Derek Carr, it should be tough for the Raiders to run on the Colts, and Carr has been good this season when attempting at least 31 passes. He has 8 games with at least 31 pass attempts, and he's scored at least 22 points in 6 of them. The past 4 quarterbacks with at least 31 pass attempts against Indianapolis have at least 311 passing yards, and 2 of them have scored at least 3 touchdowns. Mitchell Trubisky might be a sleeper, so hear me out. So Trubisky flopped as a fantasy quarterback in Week 13 against the Lions with just 14 points, but he should rebound this week against the Texans, who just struggled with Rivers. 7 of the past 8 quarterbacks against Houston have at least 283 passing yards, including 5 with multiple touchdowns. And then we have some sits. So Baker Mayfield is a sit. We've already talked about Cam and Jared Goff, but Baker Mayfield has been great for the past 2 games against the Jaguars and the Titans with 58 fantasy points over that span, including 6 touchdown passes and no interceptions. But this is just a step up in competition against the Ravens, who held Mayfield to 11 points in Week 1 on 189 passing yards, 1 touchdown, and 1 interception, along with 3 rushing yards. Mayfield also has just 1 game with more than 19 fantasy points against Baltimore in 5 career meetings, which was in Week 17 in 2018. Another one that might be someone who could bust. So Cousins is more of a bust alert than a must sit, but since he's been great in the past 5 games, scoring at least 21 fantasy points in each game over that span, but 4 of those games were at home, and he's performed poorly on the road for most of the year. In 5 road games this season, Cousins is averaging 12.8 fantasy points per game, which included a 21-point outing in Week 10 at Chicago. The Buccaneers should be fresh coming off a bye, and, you may just not want to trust Kirk Cousins in a matchup at Tampa Bay. And then we already talked about Kyler Murray being a bust alert. So for running backs, stardom will be Jonathan Taylor. So Taylor is hot right now, and that should continue to be the case this week against the Raiders, who have allowed a running back to score 3 games in a row, including 5 total touchdowns over that span. In his past 2 games against Green Bay and Houston, Taylor has at least 16 total touches, 114 total yards, 3 targets and 3 catches, and he has scored a touchdown against the Texans in Week 13. This is a guy that we've been waiting to do this all season, so that's a big thing. Myles Gaskin. So Gaskin returned, of course, for his 4-game absence due to his knee injury against Cincinnati and was eased back in with 23 total touches. He responded with 141 total yards, and he should start again and have a chance to have a quality outing against the Chiefs, who have allowed running backs to score or gain over 100 rushing yards in 3 games in a row. Gaskin has scored or gained at least 120 yards in 4 games in a row and should again be the catalyst of Miami's offense against Kansas City this week. Ronald Jones, so Bruce Arians plans to commit to Ronald Jones, although we've heard that before many times. But this seems like a logical time to lean on Jones with Tampa Bay coming off a bye against the Vikings, who have allowed 3 total touchdowns to running backs and 2 guys to gain at least 110 yards in their previous 3 games. Jones has scored at least 16 PPR points in 2 of the past 3 outings, and he should have a chance for a big game here at home. Wayne Gallman. So Wayne Gallman expects to struggle he was expected to struggle in Week 13 at Seattle with Colt McCoy under center, but it was a wrong prediction. Gallman was awesome with the best running performance of his career, gaining 135 yards on 16 carries. And it didn't like the fact that it didn't have a catch or that Alfred Morris stole 2 touchdowns, but it's hard to argue that what Gallman has done as a replacement for Devonta Freeman, he's coming into Week 14 with 6 games in a row with at least 12 PPR points, including 6 touchdowns over that span. He should stay hot against a Cardinals defense who has allowed 5 rushing touchdowns in the past 3 games. And we've already talked about J.D. McKissick. Adrian Peterson and Ty Johnson may be some sleepers. So we're waiting to find out, of course, the status of DeAndre Swift with an illness and Kerryon Johnson with a knee. But both are out. If both are out, then Peterson becomes a borderline starter in all leagues, with his value slightly higher in non-PPR formats. In Detroit's past 2 games without Swift, Peterson has 31 carries for 112 yards and 4 touchdowns, although he doesn't have a catch. Still, the Packers are among the league leaders with 11 rushing touchdowns allowed to running backs this year. And Ty Johnson, and we'll see if Frank Gore can return for Week 14 at Seattle after he left Week 13 against the Raiders with a concussion in his place. Johnson was the star for 22 carries for 104 yards and a touchdown, along with 2 catches for 13 yards and 2 targets. He won't be that good against Seattle, but the Seahawks have allowed a whopping 10 total touchdowns to running backs at their 6 games. And then Jamal Williams is a sleeper. So no team allows more fantasy points to opposing running backs than the Lions, including 23 total touches to the position. And that's great news for Aaron Jones, but Williams could also be considered a flex option this matchup. He had 8 carries for 63 yards in Week 2 against Detroit, in tandem with Jones. And 6 times this season, a pair of running backs against the Lions have scored at least 8 PPR points, including each of the past 2 games against Houston and Chicago. And then Chase Edmonds. So Edmonds, who's played at Fordham, loves going back to the New York area. Last year against the Giants, Edmonds went off for 27 carries, 126 yards, and 3 touchdowns, along with 2 catches for 24 yards. And this year against the Jets in Week 5, Edmonds has 3 carries for 36 and a touchdown, along with 5 catches for 56 yards on 6 targets. The Giants are tied for second in receptions allowed to running backs with 74, which bodes well for Kenyon Drake and Edmonds. And Edmonds should be considered a flex play in PPR for sure. As far as sitting, who we haven't talked about already is Zach Moss. So you probably want to avoid Zach Moss and Delvin Singletary if possible, but Moss is an easy guy to bench this week. He fumbled an exchange with Josh Allen in Week 13 at San Francisco and was limited to 3 carries on 9 yards, along with 1 catch for 5 yards. Singletary, who scored 11 PPR points in consecutive games, likely won't fare much better than Moss this week against the Steelers, who are number 3 in fantasy points allowed to opposing running backs this year. Even with the Steelers linebacker Robert Spilnar out, you probably shouldn't trust Moss this week in most leagues. And for let's move on to wide receivers. Some stardoms will be Corey Davis. So Davis has been fantastic this season and finally has performed like the standout wide receiver in fantasy and reality. He just had 35 PPR points in Week 13 against Cleveland, and he should stay hot again against the Jaguars team. You should expect A.J. Brown to rebound as the number 1 wide receiver for the Titans, but Davis still can be considered a number 2 fantasy wide receiver in all leagues. He had 3 catches for 36 yards and a touchdown and 5 targets against Jacksonville in week 2. And the Jaguars have allowed 8 pairs of receivers to score at least 11 points in the same game this year. Robbie Anderson is a start, and we don't know the status of DJ Moore or Curtis Samuel as of Wednesday, but both could be out in week 14 against the Broncos, who just lost cornerback A.J. Bouye for suspension for the rest of the season. Anderson has performed well when Moore and Samuel were healthy, and he has scored at least 11 PPR points in all but 3 games this year. The Broncos haven't allowed a wide receiver to score in the past 2 games against New Orleans and Kansas City, but that's deceiving because Tyreek Hill could have had 2 touchdowns against Denver in week 13, and you should like Anderson even if Moore and or Samuel play, but you should really love him if both are out. And then Brandon Ayuk. So Brandon Ayuk came back from a 1-game absence after being placed on the COVID reserve list with a strong performance in week 13 against the Bills. He scored 20 PPR points with 5 catches for 95 and a touchdown on 9 targets, and he's now scored at least 17 PPR points in 4 games in a row. He has at least 9 targets in 3 games in a row, and he looks like a go-to option in San Francisco's passing game. You also would like Deebo Samuel this week, and he scored at least 13 PPR points in each of his past 2 games. A pair of receivers have scored at least 14 PPR points against Washington in 3 of his past 4 games. And then there's Cole Beasley. John Brown has missed 4 games now this season, and Beasley is averaging 17.8 PPR points over that span. He just scored 28 PPR points in week 13 at San Francisco with 9 catches for 130 and a touchdown on 11 targets. And the Steelers secondary could be banged up this week with Joe Hayden with a concussion, Steven Nelson with a knee and battling injuries. Stephon Diggs also takes advantage of Pittsburgh's defense if those guys are out, but Beasley is also worth starting as a low-end number 2 fantasy receiver in all leagues. And then moving on to some sleepers. DJ Shark might be a sleeper because he's kind of been disappointed, and he's due for a big game soon. And it could happen this week. The Titans secondary isn't good, and it just gave up 3 touchdowns to Jarvis Landry, Rashard Higgins, and Donovan Peoples-Jones, can't speak today, in week 13. Shark has 15 targets in his past 2 games, and he scored at least 12 PPR points in 2 of his past 3 meetings with Tennessee. And, you should like him as a solid number 3 fantasy wide receiver in all leagues. And then there's CeeDee Lamb. So Amari Cooper is obviously the starting fantasy option this week against the Bengals, but don't overlook Lamb as a low-end starter as well in week 13 in Baltimore. He had 9 targets from Andy Dalton to finish with just 6 catches for 46 yards. But that's 4 games in a row with at least 6 targets, and he scored at least 15 PPR points in 2 of them. The Bengals are among the league leaders with 14 touchdowns allowed to receivers this year, and Dalton could lean on Lamb this week as part of his revenge game, so to speak. And then some sits would be like Chase Claypool, who is very much on bust alert, and Christian Kirk for sure. So when Kyler Murray was on his game earlier this year, things were great for Kirk from week 5 and 9 to span 4 games. Kirk has at least 12 fantasy points PPR-wise in each outing and scored 5 touchdowns. Since then, though, he has been a non-factor in most fantasy leagues, and you can't trust him this week against the Giants. In his past 4 games, Kirk has scored a combined 20 PPR points, and he only had 3 targets in week 13 against the Rams for 1 catch for 2 yards. And you're hopeful Kirk will rebound close to close the year out, but starting this week, there is no way you can use him in most fantasy football leagues right now. And a big bust alert would probably be Jarvis Landry because, this seems to be the case going up against Baltimore. We talked about how you might not want to trust Baker Mayfield as well. So with that said, that is your fantasy football podcast for this week. I'd like to thank you all for tuning in and listening and checking us out. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, follow the podcast on whatever podcast platform you do choose to listen to us. And don't forget to follow us on social media too. For the GSMC, this is Ethan. I'm signing out, and I'll see you all Tuesday for the wrap-up. GSMC.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. From movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.